This video today is entitled, Is White Violence a Thing? So I'm going to talk openly about white terrorism, although I'm not going to favour terrorism or favour violence, but I'm going to discuss it in a very objective sense as something that is happening, that is likely to continue to happen and to even get worse, and discuss how we should look at it as nationalists. Now, I've written this document with a few points so that I can talk a little bit more clearly on this subject. So point 1, we should always oppose political violence. Now, the first reason for this is that violence would lead to stronger efforts by the state to close down all nationalist groups. We can see that in New Zealand, after the terrorist attack there, the first thing the government thought of was seizing all the guns held by anyone, held even by farmers in the population. So it is totally counterproductive, and it would just lead to even less free speech. The second reason is we still support a society where the working class majority has a say in politics, and there is, at least formally, a democratic system, and we haven't quite got to the point of abandoning all realistic expectation that the majority of the population can force their views into the public arena. There is a democratic system, and the only reason why we're not represented in Parliament is that we haven't had a party, and we haven't honed our arguments properly. We haven't had good optics. We haven't tried enough to get representation in Parliament. Now, I'm not saying that the establishment would eventually allow democracy to lead to a nationalist government, but we're not quite at the point of having exhausted all options through democracy itself yet. So I think we have to oppose political violence and weed out from nationalist movements people who claim to support violence. The second point, the second point is that it's not wrong to point out that the way the state is behaving is producing a situation where there are few alternatives. This is not our fault. This is the fault of the state. It is what they are doing. We shouldn't allow a situation to develop where we end up taking responsibility for white violence when that is an inchoate, that is a very disconnected form of response to what is happening, and the government has to take its responsibility for what's happening. So we don't call for violence. Quite the opposite. We're actually calling for young people to join peaceful nationalist movements and not get involved in violence. So we're not calling for violence, but at the same time it will be a skewed approach. It will be a very imbalanced approach to oppose violence by those on the right, while at the same time supporting the violence by the Antifa, supporting the use of the police in closing down nationalist organisations. There will be a mismatch there. In the end, the government, the elite, bears responsibility for all violence that is happening, including that by Antifa and including that by white organisations or individuals. So we mustn't get into the situation of taking responsibility for white violence without pointing out the responsibility of the state for it. Point 3, the best thing we can do to stop violence is to build in real life, which is abbreviated as IRL, to build IRL political movements that would give people a less disconnected way of expressing their views and building real life connections with others who share those same views. So rather than people being completely isolated and then acting in a kind of mentally disturbed, totally disconnected ways, as people who live in their mum's basements and decided to become terrorists, we need to build proper IRL movements so that people can link up with other nationalists, and that can help foster their mental stability and lead them into more productive ways of expressing it. So let's look at the history of this thing, terrorism, violence. Point 4, from a historical point of view, in the 17th century, Roman Catholics were viewed as violent revolutionists. They belonged to a religion whose leader, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, had actually called on Roman Catholics to murder the Queen, murder Queen Elizabeth I. And in 1605, Guy Fawkes and other Roman Catholics sought to blow up the Houses of Parliament, which would have blown up the House of Commons, but it would also have blown up the House of Lords, including all the bishops of the Church of England as well. And if the king had been in Parliament at the time, it would have blown up the king as well. So there was a good reason to regard the Roman Catholics as being a violent minority at the time. But clearly things move on, and this would no longer be true about Roman Catholics in England today. So that is the reason that they were not included in the 1688 Bill of Rights, which mentioned the rights of non-Catholics to bear arms in their self-defense, but curiously excluded the Catholics. The reason for that is that the Roman Catholics were a violent and revolutionary minority at the time. So coming on to point 5, in recent years the Muslims have become associated with political violence. Now I draw this largely, I draw a connection largely with US foreign policy in the Middle East and the support by the US for the State of Israel and for Israel's behaviour in the Middle East. So if we accept that the influence of this cabal on US foreign policy, and this cabal, I understand it to be a CIA Zionist Saudi cabal, we can see all these elements playing out in Syria and in Yemen and elsewhere right now. If the influence of this cabal is declining, it could eventually lead to a complete US withdrawal from the Middle East. And that could lead to a fading away of Islamic violence in the West. Now, I have to be clear that I don't think the Muslims will ever be easily integrated in the West. I think crime, rape, child abuse, and their basic hostility to the host populations in countries like England, this is unlikely to be reduced and is in fact likely to rise and rise and rise. But I do think that terrorism itself by the Islamists is likely to decline as the US declines as a great power and then eventually realizes that it cannot intervene around the world in such a destructive way, especially in places like the Middle East. So whereas we have been recently in a situation where we'd hear of explosions and would think, oh, the Muslims are at it again. You know, there's been a terror attack. You think, oh, must be the Muslims. We could quite easily end up in a situation in 10 years' time where terrorism became associated with the far right. You'd hear some kind of explosion or some terrorist attack, and you think, oh, the white nationalists are at it again. And there are signs that this is gradually on the rise. So if you look at the Anders Breivik thing in Norway, everyone thought, okay, this is the Muslims killing, is it 70 or however many people at the Utøya camp in Norway. And the police chief had to emphasize it, saying, no, he's Norwegian. And the journalists there, were pretending not to get the point. They said, well, yes, the Muslims are Norwegian after all. And then the police chief replies, no, he's really Norwegian. And the journalist replies, well, yes, they are really Norwegian, because everyone who owns a Norwegian passport is really Norwegian, right? And then eventually the police chief just totally lost it and said, why are you not getting to the point? He's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian. When I say he's Norwegian, he's Norwegian, right? I don't mean he's a Norwegian citizen from Pakistan. And eventually they got the point that this was not a Muslim thing. So we were still in the paradigm at that time of thinking that all terrorist attacks had to be by the Muslims. In 10 or 20 years' time, it's going to be more likely to be by the far right, unfortunately. And this has all sorts of implications for everyone with far right views, because we're likely to come under a lot more scrutiny and a lot more very unfair police control. So let's look at point number 7 here. There is a difference between Islamic extremism and white extremism, most white violence is lone wolf in nature and cack-handed in its execution. Now, what do I mean by that? The Muslim terrorists are not lone wolves. You don't find someone who's a Muslim, who's been living in his mum's basement, doesn't know anyone, hasn't got a girlfriend or a job or anything, and just decides to go out and be a terrorist. That's not what's happening. Those people are radicalized down the mosque. To be an Islamic terrorist is a very social thing. You're socialized into it down the mosque. Whereas to be a white extremist, that's by people who don't have any social connections. They're not socialized into it. It's not that they've joined some political party, some extremist political party, and they've been talked into it. They are generally completely isolated people. That's a very important point to make. And also, because they don't have any connections, they don't have anyone to discuss tactics or whatever, they don't know how to prepare a successful attack. I'm going to put successful in inverted commas because obviously we don't want these attacks to kill innocent people. But what I mean is the Muslims are socialized into extremism and they can go out and kill hundreds of people. Whereas these white terrorists, these individual incels in their mum's basements, they can go out and do an attack that doesn't even kill anyone, because they just don't know how to do it. So the Christchurch attack by Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand was an exception in that he was quite well prepared. And if you look at the other ones that we've had in recent years, they were very small beer things. We had the man who stabbed an MP in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. Well, obviously that was a terrible thing. Then we had the lorry attack on a mosque in London that killed one Muslim. And then we had an attack on a synagogue. There's absolutely no reason why people should go and attack worshippers. Let me just make that absolutely clear. There was an attack on a synagogue in America that killed several people, and then there was another attack by John Ernest, an excellent piano player. I can't understand why he would throw his life away on this. He went and attacked a synagogue and killed one person. So you can just see just how harebrained these white things are. And there is this difference that Islamic terrorism is social. They are socialized into terrorism down the mosque, whereas white terrorism is by isolated, friendless individuals with no family support, no girlfriends, no jobs, no prospects. These people could be, and some of them are, incels. The incels means involuntary celibates, these people who lived in their mum's basements and never had a girlfriend. Or they could be MGTOW. MGTOW is men going their own way. These people who've had really bad relationships with women in the past and have become really, really anti-women as a result of it. And some of these people are prize losers too. So when the media claim that these individuals are put up to terrorism by far-right groups, this is really a lie. It's not that they were in the BNP and they were told to go and do these things. No, they are generally pure lone wolves. People with no real solid connections to the right, although some of them have ended up being photographed on demonstrations. So the thing is that IRL organisations could stop them. It's a very important point to make, that we have a big contribution to reining these people in by building a proper, peaceful nationalist movement. Lone wolves are very hard to stop, because if you see just the sheer numbers of Muslims who are interested in terrorism is really quite large in the UK. About a quarter of Muslims supported the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, and that could mean like 750,000 or more Muslims supporting terrorism in the UK. But clearly they're not. Clearly they're not actually doing anything about it. So in the fight against Islamic extremism, it's very easy for the UK security services. They only need one informant in each mosque to keep a tab on these people. That's all they need. So you can stop the Islamic extremists that way. But lone wolves, there are no informants. No one knows who they are. no one can stop them. So you can see why the lack of any IRL organisation means it's impossible to keep tabs on these people. Point 8. The left and the media laugh at dissident right supporters and claim they are losers. This ignores the fact that any society that goes out of its way to create a whole tier of people with nothing to lose and with no stake in society is heading down a dark path, and that is exactly where we are at. And the more they laugh at them for being losers, the more likely they are to push them into terrorism. In fact, multiculturalism literally aims to create a divided society, to create an alienating society with no identity, a society that doesn't include people, it doesn't include the disadvantaged. It aims to create atomized and alienated individuals, and it seems to be very successful in doing that. And then if you look at the assault on family values, where we, through the media and through the education system and even in every single workplace, are pumping things like homosexuality, transgender rights, feminism, then we've got abortion, premarital sex, divorce, and all this type of thing. All this ensures that we have a large pool of young people who are completely left out of the sexual marketplace. These people have a real grudge against society. In some of these Islamic societies, there's no such thing as any man left out of the sexual marketplace because of arranged marriages. Every man is assigned a woman, and that is how it works. This is not how it works in the West. So the media can laugh at these people, but in the end, some young people don't really have much to lose, and the only reason why they're not doing more attacks is they're not organised enough. They don't have enough equipment. They're not organised enough to carry out well planned attacks. So at the moment, where we're at is that there may be a spate of very small scale and not very lethal attacks, although people like Brenton Tarrant show that in the end some people will get a little bit more organised and could execute a really terrible and really lethal attack on innocent people. Point 9. It's undeniable that the trend of thought on the right is drifting away from democracy. We're kind of realising we're not going to achieve that much by democracy, or it's going to be difficult. Let's put it that way. Difficult to achieve much via democracy. And so there is more and more interest in violent options. You can see this on YouTube where people like John Mark are preaching open revolution. Now, I point out here that revolution is not terrorism. What is the difference between revolution and terrorism? Well, a lone wolf who kills 50 people, that's terrorism. There's no possible justification for that. He's just an individual who decides to kill 50 innocent people. And even if he does manage to kill them, that is a crime. He deserves to be punished, and that can only rebound terribly on the right. That is just terrorism, and there is no valid white nationalist argument for terrorism. Now, what if a movement of millions, a white positive movement of millions were built, and that staged a rebellion and managed to, or sought to, seize power in a coup? That's not terrorism, that's revolution. So you can see revolutions like that were conducted in, for example, in America in 1776, or in France, or in Russia. These are social revolutions by large groups of people. That's not the same thing as terrorism. Now, the left-wing parties, especially communist parties, openly preach violent revolution, and those who call for communist revolution are not harassed by the security services. Whereas anyone preaching a nationalist revolution, a seizure of power by a movement of millions of people, would be likely to be treated much more harshly. They won't take the risk. Moving on to point 10. For this reason, I don't think a white identitarian movement should espouse a seizure. I've written a seize. Let me just change that to seizure. A seizure of power by non-democratic means. we shouldn't even talk about it. I'm only mention it here as part of an attempt to dismiss the idea, or dismiss discussion of the idea. Let's put it that way. We need to focus now on building a large IRL movement, but we do so in the knowledge that if we built a large movement, we would have a better range of options one day. So the simplest and best way that a large movement could come to power would be for the elite to simply recognise a large nationalist movement had been built and had to be allowed to make a peaceful bid for political power. So that is obviously the ideal, the optimal solution. Now, if you look at where the elite are now, their attitude suggests that they're not really in the mode of thinking of allowing nationalists a share of political power. We can see the way they've reacted to Brexit. We can see the way they've reacted to Trump. They simply do not recognise that nationalists have any right to be in the political arena. But at this point, we don't have a large movement, so we mustn't engage in any LARPing or any sort of mental planning out how a coup could be achieved or anything like this. We need to just not even think about violent options. But although we're building a peaceful movement, we do so in the knowledge that at some future point, a peaceful movement would have a wider range of options eventually than the ones that we have now. Let's just put it that way. Other options would come into view if the elite were recalcitrant. Point 11. We have to realise and be realistic that white terrorism is on the rise and is going to continue to rise, and there's not much we can do about that other than to offer the creation of a peaceful IRL movement as an alternative. Now, I do think there is some responsibility on white nationalist leaders, people like Richard Spencer and Mark Collett, speaking on YouTube, to always make it absolutely clear that they're not calling for violence and to pepper their speeches with calls for peaceful activism only. Because it's possible that someone sitting in his mother's basement would listen to a speech on YouTube and misinterpret it and go out and do something stupid, and we really must seek to forestall that. But in fact, the creation of a peaceful IRL movement is a solution to terrorism. It's not something that promotes or encourages terrorism. It's something that discourages it. It gives people a better option in life. We need to pin the blame for any terrorism on the establishment, because they are clearly treading on the interests of the powerless and provoking an extreme response among a tiny minority. And it's possible that tiny minority could get a bit bigger, but still they bear the response for provoking that type of response. They bear the responsibility for provoking that type of response. Now, here's a difficult point here. I don't think we should favour white violence, but where white terrorism takes place, I don't think we should condemn it either, because that gets us into a condone or condemn paradigm that pins the blame on the powerless white person who's gone to do it. And I would prefer to say we neither condone nor condemn it. We don't condone it. We certainly don't condone killing innocent people, but we don't want to get into condemning it because we wish to pin the blame on the establishment. And we suggest the best response to it is to immediately shut the borders. So when you see something like the Brenton Tarrant terrorist attack in New Zealand, we need to say we're not going to condemn it because this is an inchoate response by a powerless individual, but we certainly don't condone killing innocent people. So the reason why we're adopting this halfway neither condoning nor condemning response is because we are blaming the establishment for creating this situation in the first place, and the best response is to immediately shut the borders. And as part of this argument, we need to point out white suicide rates which are on the rise. White men are the most likely to commit suicide. Society is not working for large numbers of people, and we cannot ignore that. We can't just say, just go away, crawl under your stone, and don't ever create a problem in society. You know, some of these people are going to overreact and overreact in an extreme way. And I would argue that the establishment, the elite, the political elite of this country bear the responsibility for that. And another thing you could point out is the way white boys are underachieving in schools compared to their IQ levels, which shows that they are being alienated by the teachers. The teachers are concentrating on the black children. They're continually being told that they're inferior, their culture is inferior, they're racist, and this type of thing. So this is the real civil rights struggle, the way white people are being treated, and especially young white men. Now, point 12. It's getting more and more likely that we will become minorities in all Western countries. In America, it seems very unlikely that you could forestall that now. Canada, very unlikely. Britain is still mathematically possible, but also very unlikely. It doesn't seem that we will be able to build nationalist organisations in Western countries quickly enough to avoid becoming a minority. We're going to have to go through a period of being a minority. Now, what happens then? What happens when we are minorities? Now, there's this phrase on the right of being black-pilled. If you're white-pilled, you're positive that the white people can win out in the end. If you're black-pilled, you think the game is already over, we've already lost. But in fact, all around the world, there are large minorities in various countries that do successfully mount a fight for their rights. And I compare this to the nationalist minority in Northern Ireland. I don't support the nationalist minority in Northern Ireland, but I'm not looking at the rights and wrongs of the Ulster situation right now. Just looking at the way Sinn Féin fought for the nationalist community despite the fact that they were a minority. They didn't just give up and say, oh, well, we're a minority, we can't do anything now. So I think that as white people become minorities, identitarian politics will take off, and that the white community, which it doesn't really feel like a community at the moment, will eventually coalesce as a community, but only after we become a minority. We will still need to fight for freedom of speech. We'll still need the right to openly and frankly talk about what's happening in our societies and argue for our interests, even as minorities. So racial politics don't become irrelevant when we become minorities. Racial politics becomes even more relevant. In other words, a few more points here. Here's an interesting one. What about the Samson option? Now, this comes from the Bible and refers to the way in ancient Israel that Samson destroyed the temple of Dagon, where he was being held. He was tied up. His eyes had been put out. He was blind. He was a very tall and powerful person, and he was tied up between the pillars of the temple. And he decided to do everything he could to push those pillars to the ground, and thus kill himself and all the Philistines. So it's like the nuclear option when you destroy society around you, killing yourself and everyone else in it. Now, the Israeli generals have spoken of their Samson option. Israel doesn't officially admit to being a nuclear country, so I can't actually say it's official Israeli policy, but it is discussed in the Israeli press that Israeli generals have spoken of a Samson option, which is where they claim the right to nuke Europe if Israel were ever on the verge of being overrun. So if the Arabs were sort of one day away from completely overrunning Europe, the final act of Israel would be to launch nuclear bombs on Germany, Britain, France, Italy, etc. And you look at that and think, well, why? Why would they nuke us? And the answer is to punish Europe for not helping them survive. Because if they don't survive, then they don't care if we survive either. So that is their Samson option, that if they're not surviving, no one else is surviving. Russia has also spoken of a kind of Samson option, where they claim that they don't need the world to survive if Russia doesn't survive. And Putin has specifically said we have no need of a world without Russia. This means that if Russia is nuked, then just before the nuclear bombs arrive in Russia, they will definitely release nuclear bombs on the rest of the world. They don't wish the world to survive without Russia. I mean, you could compare it to Britain's nuclear policy, where whatever Boris Johnson has written to the commander of Britain's nuclear submarines, well, that will be a state secret, but he's written a handwritten letter that is held by the commanders of those submarines, and it will either tell them if Britain is destroyed in a nuclear attack, you must launch the nuclear submarines to destroy our enemies, or it may actually say, well, even if we're destroyed, there's no point in destroying the whole of the world, so just go to America and try to make peace. But in Russia, they've made it quite clear, if they're being nuked, everyone else is being nuked. You know, they don't need the world to survive. It doesn't matter if the population of the world comes down to zero. If Russia is no longer in the world, they don't need the world to exist. So that's what the Samson option is. It makes me wonder if pushed right up against the wall, you could see a White Samson option. This is a very interesting idea. I'm totally cautioned against it, but you know, this is just a thought experiment, just wondering where we're heading. And I think it's fair enough to point out to the elite exactly what they're doing, just how bad it feels living in a society that's been taken away from us. Some may think, what need do we have of a white England? Why even should England survive? You know, why do we want a white England survive? Wouldn't it be better for the whole of England to be destroyed in that case? Because it's either ours or it doesn't deserve to exist. So, seen on these lines, white terrorism could become completely nihilistic or nihilistic, however you pronounce that word. So, unlike, for example, the Zionist terrorism before 1948 that aimed to see the creation of the State of Israel, in other words, it did have a constructive goal to it, white terrorism could become completely destructive, just aiming to destroy society or to ruin it for everyone. You know, having lost all hope of creating a white society, some people, a minority, could turn to completely nihilistic, destructive aims with no constructive plans in sight. Point 14. Even if we don't get to a Samson option, an alternative might be that white people eventually realise that morality and civilized values only have meaning in a society that is ours. And if the society has been taken away from us, or it's our society and we've been reduced to a minority in it, then that morality and those civilized values then become invalid. So white activists could openly encourage robbery, burglary, and any other forms of crime in order to take revenge on society. And well, those people who would argue this will be wrong in inverted commas will be preaching a morality designed to allow the non-white elite to carry on functioning as the elite of what had once been our country. So we could see a radicalized white minority espouse the same view that is advanced by black people today: no justice, no peace. Our country's been taken away from us. We will not allow peace to reign in that country after that. And you could even find white people become openly hostile to the justice system. White people always finding other white people not guilty on juries. It could become a very anti-police, very recalcitrant minority in society, in much the same way as some nationalist communities refuse to cooperate with the police. I think this is definitely the way some white communities will evolve over the long term. Now, I'm not saying that I encourage nihilism, but this is just to look at where we're heading and what the establishment is doing. And they need to change course and quickly to openly try to create a society that doesn't include everyone. It doesn't give everyone any hope. It doesn't give everyone a stake in society. This is not a logical way to run a society, and we are heading down a dark, dark path. Now, what can we do to stop people getting into this type of thing? Well, if we build IRL movements, real nationalist communities, then we will be able to sort of keep an eye on the mental health of individual nationalists and try to include them and show them how productive activism is the only way forward, because otherwise we're going to drift into more and more radical non-solutions. So I think the establishment will be making a really, really big mistake by not allowing an IRL movement to be built, because then the only alternative is extremely negative reactions by nationalists. Thank you.